Okay, so today, children, we're coming up to the end of the book, and there is a lot of information in here about things that are going to happen towards the end. The days flew by on wings. 2 weeks seemed so long to begin with, but there was so much to do, so many last things. Nick made up songs about them. The last time on the slag heap, bumping face down on the old tray and scraping his knee. The last time at chapel. The last time making a dam in the stream at the end of the garden. He was so happy that Carrie was afraid Auntie Lou might be hurt, but she didn't appear to be. She joined in Nick's songs and was as silly as he was, bright-eyed and laughing at nothing. Only Mr. Evans seemed to share Carrie's queer, sinking feeling of sadness. "I'm going to miss my assistant," he said, more than once. "You've been a real help to me, Carrie." And this rare compliment made Carrie feel sadder still each time she heard it. The last day. The night before, their suitcases were packed and waiting. Auntie Lou had washed all their clothes, darned all the holes. The range fire was stoked so they could have a last bath. Mr. Evans said, "Tomorrow dinner time we'll have a picnic." Carrie and Nick couldn't believe it. Surprise made Nick giggle. He put his hand over his mouth and Auntie Lou shot a warning glance at him. Carrie thought it was partly because they were going to have a farewell tea at Druids Bottom. When she told Mr. Evans, he'd gone very quiet, and then, just as they were going up for their bath, he suggested the picnic. "A last treat, see?" Auntie Lou had a basket filled with sausage rolls, cheese sandwiches and firm greenish tomatoes. It was an extraordinary sight to see Mr. Evans shutting the shop in the middle of the day and toiling up the mountain like an ordinary person. He sweated a lot because he wasn't accustomed to climbing. "Used to come up here when I was a lad," he said, mopping his forehead. "Seems to have got steeper since." While Auntie Lou set out the food, he sat on a flat rock to recover and talked about the old days. "Used to carry your auntie up here when I was a young man and she was a babby," he said. "I'd set her down here and dare her to move while I tickled trout in that stream. Do you remember that, girl?" Auntie Lou nodded, then blushed for some reason. She was oddly quiet, seemed in an odd mood altogether, though not an unhappy one. While they were eating, she sat staring over the valley with a dreamy look in her eyes and a small, secret smile on her face. Mr. Evans boomed on about the things he'd done when he was a boy, mostly earning money in his spare time to help his poor mother. But though Auntie Lou seemed to be listening, she wasn't listening to him. It was as if she were holding a much more exciting conversation inside her own head, Carrie decided. As soon as lunch was over, Mr. Evans was fidgeting to get back to the shop. "Hurry up, young Nick, help Auntie Lou with the basket. Jump to it double quick now, some of us have to work for our living. I'd never have got anywhere if I'd moved at your pace." And when they got back, he put on his working jacket with a sigh of relief and said, "Well, that's over." Nick said dutifully, "Thank you, Mr. Evans." Carrie said, "It was lovely, a lovely picnic." "Well, as long as you enjoyed it," he said, as if he hadn't at all, but he looked pleased all the same, and then curiously shy. He took two small parcels out of his pocket. "Might as well have these now, mightn't you? I've got a council meeting this evening. You'll be fast asleep by the time I get back." A knife for Nick, a marvellous knife in a sheath of green leather, and a small ring for Carrie, a real gold ring with a small dark red stone. "Oh," Nick said. "Oh, I've always wanted a sheath knife. I mean, the penknife you gave me for Christmas was very nice, but it doesn't cut things. This is just what I wanted. It's my very best thing." "Take care of it then," Mr. Evans said. He looked at Carrie. "The ring's beautiful," she said. She couldn't say any thank yous, because the words stuck in her throat, but Mr. Evans seemed to know just how she felt. "As long as you're pleased, just a keepsake to remember us by, from your auntie too, mind." It was easier to thank Auntie Lou. "Thank you so much," Aunt Carrie said, and Auntie Lou blushed and smiled. There were tears in her eyes, and when they went through to the kitchen, she hugged and kissed them both. She said, "Oh, there's happy I've been with you two. There's been life in this house, first time I've known it." Nick flung his arms round her. "Goodbye, Auntie Lou, I do love you." He squeezed her so hard that she gasped, and for so long that Carrie grew restless. "Do give over," she said. "You'll see Auntie Lou again. It's not the last time for that." "Last time on the railway line," Nick sang. "Last time walking along the railway line, because tomorrow we'll go in the train, puff puff. We'll go in the train and screech, whistle, screech." "Do be quiet," Carrie said. Nick pulled her face and walked beside her. "Will we be bombed in Glasgow?" "Will the train be bombed on the way?" Of course not. Carrie thought of bombs falling, of the war going on all this year. They'd been safe in the valley. going on over their heads like grown-up conversation when she'd been too small to listen. She said, "Don't be scared, Nick. Mum wouldn't send for us if it wasn't safe. Don't be scared. Anyway, I'll be with you." "I'm not scared. I'd like to be bombed. It'd be super exciting." He started to sing again. Bomb, bomb, bang, shoo, spreading out his arms and pretending to be an aeroplane flying low, machine gunning. "Shut up, you bloodthirsty boy. You're spoiling it all," Carrie said. "Let's have one last time in peace and quiet." The farewell tea was spread in Hepzibah's kitchen. Cold chicken and salad, a cheese and onion pie, a big plate of drop scones thickly buttered. The range fire was glowing, hot enough to roast anyone who stood close to it. The back door stood open to let out the heat, and Hepzibah's chickens wandered in and out, pecking at crumbs and sleepily chortling. Nick stuffed and stuffed as if he hadn't seen food for weeks, but Carrie could hardly eat anything. It was all ending so beautifully, the picnic and Mr. Evans being so nice, and the ring and the knife, and now this last lovely tea with faces she loved round the table. She was so full, so tight with happiness, she felt she would burst if she ate one more drop scone. Hepzibah wasn't eating much either. Once or twice she met Carrie's eye and smiled as if to say she felt just as she did. She cut Nick a fourth slice of pie and said, What a boy. When the last tramp sounds, the first thing he'll say when he pops his head out of his grave will be, 'Where's my breakfast?'" "Our mother said she doesn't know where he puts it all, he's so thin," Carrie said, and as soon as she'd spoken it struck her she'd never talked to them about her mother before. "What's your mother like?" Albert asked. "Well, she's quite tall," Carrie began, and then stopped. Not because she couldn't remember, but because it was such a long time since she'd seen her, and she felt strange suddenly knowing that this time tomorrow they would be on their way to Scotland, and she would be waiting for them. She thought, suppose I don't recognise her? Suppose she doesn't recognise me? And felt her face grow hot. "She's got blue eyes like mine," Nick said. "Navy blue eyes. That's why our father married her, because he's in the Navy. But she's not as pretty as you, Hepzibah, and she can't cook nearly as well. That's the best cheese and onion pie I've ever had in my whole life, and cheese and onion pie is my best thing." "And the last for now, Mr. Cupboard Love," Hepzibah said. "No more, not one crumb, or you'll be sick on the journey tomorrow." "He was sick when we came," Carrie said. "I was not." "Yes, you were, and it was all your fault, because you were stinking pig greedy and ate all my chocolate." "Shla, shla, Mr. Johnny said. It was the first thing he'd said all afternoon. He got down from the table halfway through tea and was sitting on a chair in the doorway, looking droopy and listless. "That's right, Mr. Johnny," Hepzibah said. "Hush now, the pair of you." "I'll hush if you'll tell us a story." Nick went to Hepzibah and leaned on her knee. "I'm worn out with eating," he said. "I want to sit on your lap while you tell us a story." Hepzibah heaved him up, pretending to groan with his weight. "Which one do you want then, Mr. Big Baby? You've heard them all, haven't you?" Nick sighed and wriggled comfortably. "The one about the poor African boy." "What made you think of that foolish tale?" "Mr. Johnny's playing with the skull," Albert said. He was stroking it. He had the skull half hidden in his lap, and his little hands stroked the smooth bone gently and rhythmically. Carrie had often seen him sit like that, fondling one of Hepzibah's chickens. Hepzibah said, "Put that down, Mr. Johnny, this minute." The children had never heard her speak to him sharply before. They stared in surprise, and she said in a tired voice, "Oh, it doesn't matter, I suppose. Not the old skull. But he's run me ragged just lately, picking up things around the house and putting them down where they shouldn't be. He had the silver this morning, all the best spoons out in the yard." "You just polished them," Albert said. "It was the shine that attracted him. You know he's like a magpie that way. He was only making patterns with the spoons. You've never minded before." "Things are different now, aren't they?" Hepzibah said. "I don't want Mr. Evans to find anything missing." "He'd hardly make a fuss about an old skull," Albert said, but went to Mr. Johnny just the same and held out his hand. "Come on, hand it over." Mr. Johnny scowled and covered the skull with his hands. Nick said, "That's not the way to ask, Albert. It just makes him stubborn." He slid off Hepzibah's lap. "Look what I've got, Mr. Johnny. Look what I've got, my new knife. It's sharp as a razor, a real hunting knife. But if you keep the sheath on it, you can hold it a bit. If you give me that first." Mr. Johnny looked at Nick, then he laughed and gave him the skull. Nick handed it to Carrie behind him and went on talking gently. "You just stroke the leather. Isn't it lovely?" "It's lovely and slippy. It's a beautiful knife. Mr. Evans gave it to me, and he gave Carrie a ring. Do you want Carrie to show you?" Mr. Johnny was too absorbed in the knife, running his finger along it to feel the pattern stamped out in the leather. Hepzibah said, "Show me, Carrie, love." Carrie hadn't wanted to show her in case Hepzibah should feel she ought to give them parting presents as well, but now there was no help for it. She put the skull down on the table, took the ring out of her pocket and put it on her finger. Hepzibah took her hand and bent her head over it. The little stone winked like a red star in the firelight, and Carrie thought of Mrs. Gotobed suddenly, of the time she'd had tea with her, and of the way the flames danced in her rings as she stroked the silk of her dress. And because she was remembering that, when Albert said, "It's her ring, isn't it?" she wasn't altogether surprised, only felt a little shivery shock, as if something she'd been half expecting to happen had happened at last. Hepzibah's fingers tightened on hers. She said reluctantly, "Well, very like it, perhaps," and looked up at Carrie with what seemed like a kind of apology. "It is," Albert said. "It's her garnet ring, the one she wore most of the time." Hepzibah said, "All right, Albert, even if it did belong to her, it belongs to Mr. Evans now, doesn't it?" "He stole it," Albert said. "You can't steal what's your own. His sister's rings are his now, to keep or to give away as he chooses." Hepzibah smiled at Carrie. "I'm glad he gave it to you. Mrs. Gotobed would be glad too if she knew. So don't you pay any heed to Albert's old nonsense." Albert said, "It's not nonsense. He took it then, if you don't like the word steal. Took it without saying anything, and he'd no right to do that until it was all settled up. All the estate. That's the law, Hepzibah. I read it all up in the library." He looked at Carrie and his eyes sparkled with triumph. "And if he took the ring, he might have taken something else, mightn't he?" Carrie said slowly, "I'll put the skull back first, should I? It's in its box in the library." She wanted to be alone for a minute, away from Hepzibah's kindness and Albert's triumphant look. Of course, he'd been right all along. Mrs. Gotobed had made a will, and Mr. Evans had stolen it out of meanness and greed. He wanted Druids Bottom, and he didn't care what happened to Hepzibah and Mr. Johnny. That was the worst thing, worse than stealing a ring or even the will. He didn't care about anyone. He'd turn Hepzibah out and live here himself, where he'd no right to be. Carrie felt stifled. The library window was open as she went to stand by it, gulping in air. The evening breeze cooled her forehead and ruffled the surface of the horse pond in the yard. The horse pond was bottomless, Albert had said, when he threw the stone in. Carrie's thoughts were like bits of a jigsaw whirling round in her head, separate pieces but all fitting in one to another. Albert throwing a stone and it falling, bombs falling on cities, houses crumbling like sandcastles, horrible but somehow exciting to think of, walls crumbling. And the curse the African boy had put on Druids Bottom if his skull ever left it. It had been taken out once and all the plates cracked and the mirrors. Then they brought it back and the house had stood safe ever since, just so Mr. Evans could live here, fill it with his meanness and greed. But the horse pond was bottomless. Carrie lifted her arm and threw the skull as hard as she could. It sailed high in an arc, then plopped into the pond. A few ripples, then nothing. She stood staring out at the pond and in the dark grove rising up the mountain behind it. She was shaking all over. Albert said behind her, "What are you doing? Hepzibah's waiting." Had she sent him to comfort her, Carrie said. "Nothing. I'm coming." She turned to face him and saw his glasses flash in the gloom. He said awkwardly, "It's all right, you know. Hepzibah's found a place. A farmer who wants a housekeeper and who'll take Mr. Johnny. It's a bit bleak, she says, a hill farm, but it's good and remote, and that's best for him. He'll be all right once he's settled." Albert said, "So all's well that ends well, you might say." He sounded ill at ease, and she was terrified suddenly. Had he seen what she'd done? But all he said was, "Let's be friends, Carrie." And that was easy to answer. She said, "But we are friends, aren't we, Albert?" "Friends, of course, and they promised to write." "You write first," Albert said. "Care of Mr. Morgan, the minister." Carrie laughed, but he meant it. "I shan't write till you do, and if you don't, I'll know, won't I?" "Know what?" Carrie asked, but he pulled a silly face and said nothing. It was as if some queer shyness had seized him. When they left, he didn't offer to walk them up through the grove, and Carrie wasn't sorry. She felt too choky for talking. "Mr. Johnny will see you up to the ridge," Hepzibah said, but Carrie shook her head. "We'll be all right. I'm not scared any more." She wasn't scared, not even when she was halfway up the path, dark yews all around her, and heard the sound she'd heard the first time. A soft, gentle sigh, a stirring and a breathing. Nick was some way ahead. Carrie stood still and listened, but she wasn't afraid. It seemed a comforting sound now, as if the mountain had grown friendly towards her. They ran along the railway line. "We're late," Carrie panted. "I hope Auntie Lou won't be angry." "Oh no, she won't be angry," Nick said. His eyes slid slyly sideways at Carrie and he started to giggle. "I don't see what's funny," Carrie said. and this set him off properly. He laughed so hard that he had to stop running. He doubled up and lurched about, clutching his stomach. For heaven's sake, Carrie said. Of course she won't really be angry. I know that, silly fool. I only meant she might worry, and that'd mean of us, wouldn't it, on our last night? She marched off and left him. He followed her at once, as she knew he would, and slipped his hands into hers. He said very meekly, "Honestly, Carrie, I don't think Auntie Lou will be worried." And she wasn't. Couldn't have been, because she wasn't at home. Lights were on everywhere in the shop, in the passage, in the kitchen. "Wasting electricity," Carrie said, horrified. "She must have gone mad. Good thing we got home before Mr. Evans." She'd left their supper ready on the kitchen table, a plate of bread and dripping, covered with a cloth and a jug of milk with a note propped against it. "That's for him," Nick said, watching Carrie. He wrapped his arms round him like a boy hugging a secret, but he was so excited it came spilling out of him. "She's gone," he said. "Gone with Major Cass Harper. They're getting married tomorrow." "You knew?" Carrie cried. "Nicholas Willow, why didn't you tell me? Or I could hit you." She doubled her fists, and Nick laughed and dodged out of reach round the table. "You might have told Mr. Evans." "Oh, Nick, did she think that? Was that why she told you and not me?" He looked at her hurt face and stopped jumping around. "Well, not really, and she didn't really tell me. It was just that I guessed. I'd seen them quite a few times mooning about, and I asked her if she was going to marry him. She wouldn't say even then, but I plagued her a bit till she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. She said, 'Keep it dark,' not meaning you mustn't know, but I thought, well, you know what you are. Sorry for him all the time. Poor Mr. Evans." "I'm not sorry now," Carrie said. So there you go, lots of things have happened in this chapter. Well, how will the story end?